You're listening to Kill Cliff's Hazard Ground Podcast, with service members from across the military, sharing their stories of combat and survival. And now, here's your host, Mark Zinno.
Welcome into the Hazard Ground Podcast. As always, we appreciate you joining us each and every week. Before we get to this week's guest, who is also in the podcast business, we'll tell you about that coming up here in just a moment. A couple of quick reminders. Please follow us on all the social media sites, Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram at Hazard Ground Podcast. Check out our website, hazardground.com. And don't forget about that Amazon promotion. Right on the website, hazardground.com. You click on the Amazon button at the bottom of the homepage. It's also under the sponsors tab. From there, do all of your normal Amazon shopping, buy whatever you like, buy something for me because, well, hey, as a wonderful host, I deserve something from you guys. Just kidding. Anyway, you do all your normal Amazon shopping. We'll get a percentage of what you guys spend, and then we will donate a percentage of that back to some of the charities you've heard featured here on the Hazard Ground. It works the same way from your smartphone. So if you go to hazardground.com on your smartphone and click on the Amazon button there, it'll redirect it to the Amazon app. So all of your credit card information is stored. It's very easy, very user-friendly. Hazardground.com is our website. Please continue to leave us Apple reviews. We're starting to climb up the ranks on the Apple Podcast. Want to crank the top 100, and we can't do that without your support. So please leave us a review on Apple Podcast. Doesn't have to be a long one, just something short and sweet. Give us 5 stars. Tell us why you love the show. And if you're lucky, you'll get rewarded by us posting your review on our social media site. So yeah, obviously that's the reason you go ahead and do it. All right, on to this week's episode about a former Army warrant officer who's a former infantryman with multiple deployments to Afghanistan. Currently, he's an MBA student, but he also hosts a podcast called the Panjwai Podcast, which highlights service members who served in the Panjwai province in Afghanistan. He is Curtis Grace joining us on the Hazard Ground Podcast. Curtis, welcome, man. Thank you for being here.
Thanks for having me, man.
Okay, so we're both in the podcast business, and as I've always said to people, there is nothing proprietary about the veteran space. So welcome to the podcast industry in the military world. But look, it's great that we're similar in that sense. We're both talking to veterans about their personal stories. Yours just has a very, very specific focus, and that was where you deployed to as well in the Panjwai province in Afghanistan. So it's very personal. I think that's great. I think it's fantastic that you're taking your experience and sort of springboarding it into others to tell their experience, which is kind of the same thing that we do here. So continued success with the Panjwai Podcast.
Yeah, thanks. I really appreciate that.
So, and you can tell, folks, he's all set up with his podcasting equipment and everything. If you're watching on our YouTube channel, by the way, I forgot to mention our YouTube channel and the Kill Cliff TV app, where you can watch all of the podcasts that we have, as well as listen to them in the normal audio fashion. So, Curtis, let's start back at the beginning for you. How did you end up as an 11 Bravo grunt in the Army?
Well, a girl broke my heart, so that's definitely a place to start. I was
not a woman, bro.
I actually always thought I'd end up in the military. I just fooled myself into thinking it was kind of like automatic. You got a college degree and you just be this wonderful officer and think go your way. And once I kind of realized that wasn't the case, I started to get the itch to go to combat, and I realized that there was probably a time frame for that to happen. It was kind of going away. This is back 2010. So I was like, well, what's the fastest way for me to get into combat? And that was, 11 Bravo OSIT into a deploying unit. So that's what I did. I went to Infantry OSIT on the shortest timeline that I could. And I got my wish a little bit too well, as probably 6 weeks after I got to my unit, I was in Afghanistan. So it was
nobody tried to talk you out of this whole process. I mean, no one said to you, look, bro, it's a girl, you'll get over it. Don't do this. There was never any of those conversations.
No, because it really wasn't about the girl. That was just kind of drove me to do it faster, I guess. But really it was, people did try to talk me out of it because I had pretty high GT scores. So I was a little bit overqualified for what they were typically slotting into the 11 Bravo slot. But as I'm sure you've run into many times talking to 11 Bravos, they actually tend to be exceptionally smart. It's one of the smartest MOSs in the U.S. Army. So they only tried to talk me out of it for a little bit. Once they knew they had me, they kind of just let it go and let me go off and do my thing.
I mean, when you say they, was it your parents? Was it friends? Was it other people who were in the military, or?
Oh, the recruiters. Yeah.
Oh, but I meant in general, like nobody tried to dissuade you from joining the military at all?
No, my family's always been extremely supportive of the military. My stepfather is a Kiowa pilot, so he was kind of part of the process of, me joining the Army. And one thing that kind of stood out is, being a pilot was something that was kind of always on my wish list. But he felt, and I've also, in talking to other veterans, felt that getting that ground experience first would benefit me down the road if I did decide to become a pilot. So I felt that, becoming an 11 Bravo first would better prepare me for any future in the military, but particularly to become a pilot.
Yeah, I mean, that's sort of interesting because becoming a pilot isn't easy. There's a lot of obstacles and things that can trip you up along the way. And most people take the most direct line to that. And people who don't start out in that line typically have a hard time breaking in to that world. And that never deterred you at all about worrying about, listen, that's an option that might not be available. Even didn't the recruiters kind of tell you, hey, that's probably not the easiest way to be a pilot?
They did. And we did talk about the direct entry program, which is like the high school to flight school, which is where you can essentially enlist as a warrant officer. Mm-hmm. But for me, I really wanted that ground combat experience. So the obstacles in a way didn't really deter me. I felt that I had the skills and capability to do it. And I'm not usually the kind of person that lets people tell me I can't do something. So if you tell me I can't do something, I'm more inclined to push forward and actually try to do it.
All right. So what was the date, the month when you signed on the dotted line?
Ooh, I signed on the dotted line sometime in April of 2011, but I got on the bus to go to basic training on October 3rd, 2011, which has historically been a pretty eventful date for me and also for
military history. Yeah. To say the least, a very eventful day. So less than a year later, you're in Afghanistan. How quickly does that happen? How does it come about?
Oh my gosh. So I got to Fort Stewart against every earning in my body. Everybody wants to go to all the other units. But so I got to Fort Stewart. I was in reception and I was supposed to go to a different brigade. And they said, hey, 11 Bravos, stay in formation. Everybody else can go. And they're like, hey, raise your hand if you are married. So, okay, married people can leave. And there are probably about 40 of us still standing there. They're like, your orders are changing. You're going to 164 and you're deploying in like 3 weeks. So it was like,
wow.
And that was probably a week out of basic training that they told us that.
Damn. Were you like, whoa, this is way too fast. I'm not ready for this sort of relationship.
I was ready to go. I thought I was the greatest infantryman that God had ever created. I was straight out of basic training. I thought I was going to go win the war.
Did you even get a chance to go to infantry school before you had left?
Yeah. Yeah. So they do. When I say basic training, I just loop it all into one because for infantry, we do OSA.
Okay, gotcha. I was going to say, you sort of skipped a step there. I'm like, wait a minute. So quickly you get to Afghanistan. Like, do you know, how much time do you have with your unit to gel? How much time are you still the FNG by the time you land in Afghanistan?
I had, I think, 3 work days with my actual unit before we stepped off. So we did our reception thing, but my unit was actually at NTC when all this was happening. So what they did is they created this abbreviated train up, and I can't remember what they called it. But they took all of us that got selected for that short notice deployment, and they did everything that they had to do. Your team live fires, squad live fires, platoon live fires, got all your gear, did all that stuff. We did it in like 2.5 weeks. And then they sent us to our company. And as you know, before you deploy, you have like 4-day weekends every weekend before you deploy.
Yeah.
So we got there on like a Tuesday. We worked a Wednesday, and then Thursday was off. And then we were back again on Tuesday, and we deployed on a Wednesday. So I met the people actually in my company for 3 or 4 work days, maybe. And then I was on a plane with them heading to Afghanistan.
Are you told anything at that point in time about what you're going to be doing?
A little bit. Because at that time, everyone's hearing about coin, right? So we're building bridges and wells and doing all that kind of stuff. So that's kind of what I thought we would be doing.
Bullshit.
Yeah. But every time I asked, they're like, no, it's combat. We're going to combat. I was like, okay, great. That's what I signed up for. But I didn't really realize until we got there that that's really what our job was. There were coin operations going on in Panjwai. It was so dangerous that none of the NGOs would go in there.
Yeah. Coin is a fancy term for those civilians listening, short for counterinsurgency. But yeah, and the way to do that is through hearts and minds and building up cities and everything else. It's not like direct action counterinsurgency. And whatever flag officer thought that up, you got a whole bunch of pats on the back, and everybody thought it was great. And in reality, it's complete and utter horseshit. And I say that only because of where we are now. All the hearts and minds in the world, all the bridges, all the schools, and everything else, And as we sit here recording this, in the beginning of August, and we're watching Afghanistan fall back in the hands of the Taliban, all that infrastructure in the world didn't matter to a single person. I mean, it's great in theory, and it seems like it works on paper, but in reality, when you're applying it to a 2,000-year-old mentality of how to live and survive, violence rules the day still, and bridges and schools and everything aren't going to fix that. So, again, it's just one of those things where it seems like it was going to be effective, but it never was. I'm off my soapbox. I apologize. Now, you had honestly, maybe fired your weapon a half dozen times by the time you get on a plane, right? In your entire life, if that.
Yeah.
And now they're asking you to go into combat.
I felt super confident. They did a great job in basic training and telling me that I was straight up a killer. So I bought into it, hook, line, and sinker. I thought I was going to, like I said, I thought I was going to win the war. And the first thing that they hand me in the war zone isn't even a freaking rifle; it's a mine detector. I was like, wait, what?
That's pretty good. So you get there and you realize that it's not counterinsurgency, it's straight combat. What's the nature of day to day? I mean, are you outside the wire a bunch, or are you sitting back on a fob? What's the experience like when you first get there?
So it evolved slowly, and it's worth pointing out that we had an exceptional company commander. He had just come to us from Ranger Bat, so he was really motivated. He had a lot of experience in the area, and I got the idea that he kind of jockeyed for this particular posting because of what it entailed. That he felt uniquely qualified to run that particular outpost. So when we got there, the unit that we were placed hadn't been patrolling much outside of the immediate vicinity of the COP. So that's what our first patrols were. They were pretty close, pretty quiet. As the deployment ramped up and we started pushing into some of these more contested areas, you're talking at least one squad or platoon is out the wire every day doing the long dismounted patrol. One platoon or squad is out doing some sort of vehicle support, and one is on QRF. And the QRF unit's always going out for something. Something's always happening. So typically your vehicle driving day, which might be ferrying one of the other units around, would kind of be your day off. But it would just be long dismounted patrols, really just long movements to contact, shielded under the guise of going to do a key leader engagement. So we're going to go to this town and we're going to talk to this, village elder, but we're really just going to these areas because that's where the Taliban is, and we're expecting to take contact.
Right. Now, for geographic reference for everybody, Panjwai is about 90 minutes west of Kandahar, right? I mean, it's not far away.
Really close. So as the crow flies, it's probably about 15 miles.
Okay.
So Panjwai is a district that is within the Kandahar province. So you would think of like a county. And it's one of the larger districts in Kandahar just because it entails a good part of the Rajasthan desert. But the habitable zone of Panjwai is actually pretty small, probably about 30 to 40 kilometers wide.
All right. So what's the sort of lay of the land from the standpoint of how much, I mean, you're not in huge mountains there, but is there a lot of sort of civilian, populace? Are there small cities and towns and everything?
So it's an incredibly agrarian area. So they grow a lot of grapes, a lot of drugs, all that kind of stuff. So everything's kind of built around that. There's a river to the north and a river to the south that kind of come together and form what we would kind of like call the Horn of Panjwai. It comes down to a point, and these rivers basically irrigate this area. So it's extremely verdant. It's full of greenery. You've got walls around every single field. A lot of the fields are great fields, and the way that they dig those is they essentially dig trenches. So that's the majority of the fields in the area. So Panjwai really is just a really humid, dense trench network. With probably a kalot, which would be a village, maybe every a kilometer. It may sometimes even less. So it's on one hand, it's incredibly rural because it's all farmers and it's greenery and there's not a lot of modern infrastructure. But on the other hand, it's very urban because you have all these tiny little towns, and the population of this small area is something like 20 to 30,000 people. There are a ton of people there.
By the way, I appreciate how you said grapes and drugs so nonchalant, as if, you buy those things in the same place. They grow grapes and drugs. Also, that Panjwai is basically considered the spiritual home of the Taliban. So it's a big stronghold for the Taliban. How quickly do you start to see contact from the enemy?
So for us, when our platoon was the first to take contact, it was about 3 weeks. And like I said, that was mainly because we were following in the footsteps of our previous units, so we didn't extend very far away from the base. Once we started extending our patrols away from the base, that it was constant. So I think I earned my CIB on April 25th, 2012. And then I earned it many more times. It was pretty constant everywhere from the end of April all the way until we left in December. It was pretty much every patrol somebody was getting into it.
That's crazy. When do you start sustaining your first casualty?
So our first, I think our first casualty was unfortunately Master at Arms 2 Sean Brazos, who was killed on May 30th. I'm pretty sure that's the date. 2012, and he was shot on a major clearing operation, and that same operation is where we started to take more wounded as well, some shrapnel and stuff like that. After that operation, we started to see a lot more IEDs. We had our first IED casualties on June 12th and 14th. Two engineers, Specialist Pinnock and Sergeant Joseph Lilly, were killed, and actually just 2 days prior to that, we lost Corporal Bryant Luxmore to small arms fire. So very, very shortly after we started seeing contact, we started to see not only wounded, but we started to lose guys.
Are you at this point overwhelmed? I mean, you thought you were going to win the war by yourself, and you're quickly starting to see your brothers fall. Or is there any part of you that's sort of wishing you hadn't overestimated what this whole experience was going to be like?
A big part of it, because I think the part that we didn't plan for was the IED aspect. Because when you think about IEDs, everyone goes to Iraq, right? We're thinking about big giant bombs. They're on we're not worried about stepping on them.
Guilty. Got the t-shirt.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, my first IED was a big one in my truck. But very quickly after that, it was all these little tiny, you would call them toe poppers, like 5 to 10 pound IEDs. But I mean, it's enough to take a guy's leg off. And I think we lost 9 to 10 guys' legs to these things over the course of the deployment, in addition to our killed in action. And that was the part that was really started to mess with guys. You know, small arms contact, we can train for that. We can react to that. We have the advantage after the first exchange of gunfire. But with the IEDs, they were much better at placing them. We had a very big learning curve to figure out where they are, how to find them, and how best to deal with that tactic. And it was probably after the engineers were killed, June 12th, that we really were like, hey, we are not, that's when the psychological impact started to hit guys, and that we're not prepared for this. And it was a very psychologically demanding deployment for a lot of guys. We had very, very heavy mental attrition.
At any point in time, are you second guessing this whole thing?
No. And I think, like I said, remember, I go back, I'm just like, I couldn't at that time in my life, there's no way I could have ever quit something that I had started. And I was like, I'm through it to the end. But there were definitely days I'm like, fuck this. Like, it's like, what are we doing? Like, I cannot keep, why are we going out? Why are we doing this? Why are we the only ones in our battalion that are seeing this? Can we get any help? Can we get any reinforcements? And, you know, I'm glad we didn't get help or reinforcements, because, you know, there's a certain pride that we finished the job that we started. But yeah, I mean, once we started taking casualties, you really started to wonder, like, why are we even doing this?
Yeah, I mean, and that's that feeling overwhelming, and especially when you recognize that and you come to the acknowledgement that this is diminishing returns at best, and then you start to lose more guys on top of it. The level of frustration mounts fairly quickly. What was that like for you?
So I think for me, it was a lot slower process because I was brand new. You know, straight out of basic training. I didn't really know any better. I thought this was a normal deployment. I thought this is how they all were. So I was like, hey, this is what everyone's been doing for 11 years. I'm just going to put my head down and keep walking. But a lot of guys that were more seasoned, that had seen other deployments, they started to have those questions and those issues a lot sooner. And those were the guys that were trying to make changes, trying to allow us to do things safer. But, you know, there's the broad spectrum of how people react to things. Some of those guys just like, hey, it's not worth it. And, you know, they ended up on Mayor's Cell, or they ended up at different bases or something like that. And, you know, there's a certain amount of controversy between people that said that can't do it. But personally, for me, I'm like, hey, everyone reaches their breaking point, and I'm fine with that. I never reached it on that deployment. But I had no hate for anybody that realized it just wasn't worth it for them. That's fine.
Yeah. So you're going through all this and you're losing people. Are you, oh, can you even be aware of mentally what it's doing to you while you're going through it?
No, I mean, and we tried. It did come to a point later when we had a very bad day towards the end. Just a massive mass cal that pretty much just wiped us out of all of our NCO leadership. And at that point, that's when we realized that our platoon was messed up, that we needed some time. And fortunately, we were able to work the strings and get the combat stress team onto the post and give us a couple days to talk to them. But it wasn't until this was October. It was October 3rd and 4th, ironically, that
Oh,
operation
2012.
of 2012. And it wasn't until then that we really realized that there might be issues here. But then again, we got back up and we finished the deployment. We came back. We were rock stars. We had this massive combat deployment. And I think it took guys several more years to realize that that deployment wasn't normal and that it's really messing guys up. And it's really, even doing the podcast now, is when a lot of this stuff is coming up for people that they're like, hey, like, I'm glad I can talk about this now because I haven't talked about it for 9 years.
Curtis, I wonder, and for just some context for people who may or may not know about the Kandahar Massacre, that's U.S. Army Staff Sergeant Robert Bales left the post, walked on his own through a neighborhood, from house to house, killing 16 civilians, wounding 6 children. Eventually, he was, sentenced to life in prison for the whole thing. He fully admitted to the crimes. But I say that because we were talking before we started recording that happened just before you guys had got there. So you had been aware of the incident. But I mean, was there any talk of combat stress and PTSD? Like, or did everybody just chalk it up to, well, that guy just went nuts and that was the end of it and nobody talked about it anymore? Because that should have been, in hindsight, a red flag for everybody that what's going on here is putting an immense amount of stress on people.
Yeah, and I think that was around the time that conversation was really starting to become mainstream and the stigma on that kind of stuff was starting to go down, but it wasn't down yet. It was still kind of like, hey, you got to put your head down and go forward. And I don't think it would be controversial to say that if you listen to our podcast and you get kind of an idea of what Bales was like, everyone's going to look back at their unit and be like, hey, man, I know someone like that. I know someone that's been on 4 combat deployments and has had all kinds of family and financial problems and it's just not right in the head. Like, we've all met that guy. And that's not excusing what he did at all. Like, he took it a step beyond just the guy that has like 4 divorces or whatever. But everyone has seen the stress that these repeated, long, grueling deployments, especially in Iraq, where you had like infantry guys driving around for 14 months, coming back for 6 months and going back and doing it again. I think that eventually did become part of the conversation with what Bales did, is because it wasn't an uncommon like profile of a soldier at that time.
Yeah, I mean, it's just I just want to be able to provide as much context for what you guys had gone through, and you keep sort of glossing over. We went back and did the deployment and everything else, but obviously you're sustaining more casualties along the way. Obviously, none of this is getting easier, and you not once do you ever sort of look at this and go, "Man, this is bad."
Yeah, and I think it's because we were a very young unit. I would say at least 80% of us on that deployment had never deployed before. No, like, had never seen combat or anything like that. So we were looking at this with through a weird kind of filter that we didn't understand, and we wouldn't understand for quite some time. So a lot of us were just like, "Hey, put your head down, keep going, keep fighting." Um, and I for better or worse, I think that worked to some guys' advantage, just still having a little bit less context about what was going on.
I mean, the youth being sort of part of your resiliency of the whole thing. Do you ever wonder how you made it out alive?
Oh, every day. I mean, and the close calls just stack up. I mean,
Like
there.
how so?
So, I mean, I drove over 2 IEDs. One was fairly large. I was the minesweeper for 6 months out of the 9 months of the deployment. So I was at the front of the element with the mine detector, and I barely knew how to use the thing. I don't know how many that I stepped on that weren't turned on. Um, I've been shot in my backpack, just barely missing a claymore in the pack. One of the rounds went in between the pack and my plate. So just, you're talking 2 inches from my spine, and I'm a casualty. I've switched out mine detectors with people, and then 5 minutes later they stepped on an IED. I mean, I think anybody who's been to war has these stories about the time it almost got them. And when we talk about how many IEDs were in the ground, how many small arms contacts we had, I'm honestly amazed we only lost 5 people in terms of killed in action, because the opportunities that existed for far worse, it just blows my mind. I can't believe we didn't lose more people.
Crazy. When you get back from that deployment, is there a sense of relief? Is there a sense of, thank God it's over? Like, what are you thinking and feeling when you guys get back?
I think it was a big part that, when we came back to all of our wounded buddies on the tarmac. So it was this really awesome experience of getting home, our own relief, but then our relief at seeing that they were okay. Because that's the first time we've seen them not on a medevac bird or not lying in a field or on a stretcher or something like that. So there's an immense emotional reaction to not only our own safety, because, the deployment wasn't over until you stepped off that bird in Hunter Army Airfield.
Yeah.
And then you're like, okay, now it's over. Now I can go see my family. Now I can change into real person clothes. And there's Clark. And he's not walking yet, but he's okay. And the last time I saw him, I wasn't sure he was going to be. And that was a super powerful experience for everybody.
What's the first thing you do when you get back?
I took a very, very long shower.
I mean, after that, did you go take leave? Did you go visit family, or you kind of guy who just went right back to work?
So they did. This was at this time they were doing like the 2 week of out processing.
Right.
So the night of it, did shower, and then I blew off my family, and me and the boys went out. And we got hammered in Savannah, so it was a great night.
Where'd you go?
Oh, Savannah Smiles. I can't remember who else we went. Like
I'm familiar. I'm not too far from Fort Stewart. Spent a lot of time there, so Savannah is a hop, skip, and a jump away theoretically.
And it's a great town. If only you didn't have to drive 50 minutes from Fort Stewart to get there.
Yeah, that's the other part. They kind of allure you into, hey, it's right near Savannah. Yeah, not so much. That's like saying Austin is near Fort Hood. Yeah, not so much.
No, not at all. But basically during those 2 weeks was kind of our decompression with each other. So we go out and we get drunk, or we go out to dinner, we'd hang out together. We got to do, especially for us that had just joined the unit right before, our only experience with these guys was in combat. So
Right.
I'm getting to know my friends for the first time, because my first interactions with them was us like fighting for each other's lives. This was really interesting in those 2 weeks to actually get to know all these people beyond the Army.
Any discussions whatsoever about mental health, PTSD, any of that stuff? Did anybody bring up the fact that they might not be okay?
This was still a time. I don't think anybody really did. I think everybody was still lying on their post-deployment assessment saying we're fine. And there were quite a few people saying that, hey, I'd like to talk to somebody. But as soon as it got to the point where they started talking about medication or stuff like that, people would kind of balk and step away. So maybe 2 or 3 people took it seriously. I know myself, I was laser locked on flight school. So I was like, no, I'm good. I wouldn't even consider the possibility that what I experienced would affect me in any way whatsoever. So it's not that I necessarily lied on my post-deployment evaluation, but I certainly I was honest about what
I just reserve certain things for myself.
Right.
Yeah.
I do know that we did receive a little bit extra attention from like the post-deployment psychologists, just because our company had experienced a disproportionate amount of combat relative to the rest of the battalion. But there was really no emphasis other than that. If guys didn't self-identify that they were having issues, that was pretty much the end of it. And we started getting ready for, gunnery in the fall or whatever.
I hate asking this question, but any of those guys end up not alive anymore after the fact?
Not due to suicide. We have been extremely lucky, knock on wood, that everyone who has had issues has sought help, which has been kind of the delayed situation. No one really sought it immediately, but guys right now, and especially in the last 4 to 5 years, have been excellent about going and getting help. The guys that are in, the guys that are out. And we've been very fortunate, at least on our platoon level. I can't speak for the entire company, that we've not lost anybody. Guys have had some rough times for sure, but they've all bounced back from it.
All right. So you're laser locked on flight school. Do you already have a slot? Do you? I mean, what's left for you to sort of bridge this gap here?
So once I was back, I started the application process, and it took. I think I got accepted in September. So we came back in December of 2012. I got my acceptance in September of 2013. Because you have to go through, you have to get a flight physical, you have to take the test, you have to do all this kind of stuff. So it was actually, I was pretty pleased to get it, the whole process done in 9 months. But yeah, it's September. I got the great news, and then in January of 2014, I was off on my way to Fort Rucker.
Did any of your buddies look at you like sell out, you're leaving us kind of deal?
No, because I think, once you've already had that experience with them, they're like, okay, you're legit. You're not quitting on us. You've got your CIB. We've seen you in combat. You did what you've done your part. We also just had a really exceptional company. The guys on the majority were very supportive of stuff like that. So we sent guys to Ranger Regiment. We sent guys to selection. I went to flight school. The same company commander that I mentioned earlier was incredibly supportive of guys going out and furthering themselves and taking advantage of those opportunities. To the extent that once he knew that I wanted to go to flight school and he knew that I had the scores and the aptitude to do it, he pulled me from the line, which I was very much against at the time, put me in headquarters and said, hey, this is so that if you have anything you need from me at all for me to sign, you can come directly to me. You don't need to go through a team leader and a squad leader and a platoon sergeant and a PL. Just come to me. I'll sign it. I'll get you what you need. So the company was incredibly supportive from the top to the bottom of my goals and other guys' goals moving forward in the Army.
Must have been a pretty comforting feeling. It's not always the case.
No, it's definitely not always the case. And I am thankful every day for his support and for the luck of just ending up in that company. It's, it's the Army. I could have ended up in much, much, much worse situations.
So you're off to Fort Rucker, right? I mean, is it warrant officer school first and then flight school, or the other way around?
It's an 8 or 7 week warrant officer candidate school.
Okay.
Which is, it's really just a hazing. I mean, it's not worse than basic training physically, but they have a very strict set of rules. So it's a game. You play the game, you graduate, you get your dot, and you get paid a lot more. And then you can move on to flight school.
Okay. So nothing impressive about WOC?
No, I mean, we wrote some really cool songs. But other than that, I don't really think there was anything.
You get to flight school. Obviously, it's a lot of studying, a lot of hours. I mean, how long is it? It's been a part of 6 months easily, right?
It depends on the airframe that you choose.
Okay.
Once you start the flight portion of flight school, and I always consider flight school from start to finish be like walks until graduation, which is typically 2 to 2.5 years.
Oh, wow.
Once you start the flight portion, there's 2 sections. There's primary, which is where you learn how to fly a helicopter, you learn how to perform instrument flight, and you learn basic like Army flight, like flying low altitudes, navigation, stuff like that. That's usually, I want to say 4 to 5 months. And that's a lot of fun. That's when you get to fly all these little tiny birds that are just designed for training, and you get to watch all your friends make stupid mistakes. And it's, it honestly is one of my favorite times of flight school, because the stress was fairly low for most of us, because there's a certain level of aptitude required to get there, and if you're there, you know how to study and you know how to prepare yourself and you know to do the stuff. But there's not any level of aptitude that can prepare you for like putting your hands on the controls. So you get to make fun of your buddies when it takes them 20 hours to learn how to hover or whatever. It's just fun to watch, and it's fun to learn and develop these skills over the course of I want to say about 100 hours of flight in the primary phase. And then you move on to advanced aircraft. So, and in between those, you get to pick your aircraft based on your placing in the class. And I was very fortunate to be able to pick the Apache. And that stems back to being a ground guy and seeing what they did for us. And the Kai was what they did for us. And I wanted to perform that mission in the future. I wanted to be that support for the ground force going forward. That was the mission that I wanted to do. So I was lucky to get Apaches. And the Apache course is about 6 months. But you have a gap in between the courses. So
Gotcha.
It doesn't go straight through.
So after flight school, you're headed where?
South Korea. Which as an enlisted guy, all I heard was horror stories about Korea and how horrible it was and how much it was boring and you couldn't do anything. And unfortunately, that is true. It was true at the time for most of the enlisted service members in Korea. But as an officer, you had the ability to have a car, so you could drive yourself around. And if you work the system right, you could live off post, which I was able to do. So for me, it was a mostly positive experience in Korea.
Wow. How quickly do you end up deploying from there again?
So I actually got to leave Korea a little early because I got orders to Joint Base Lewis McChord in Tacoma, and that they were going to Afghanistan. But before I could go there, I had to get qualified in the newer model, Apache, the Echo model. So I got to leave a couple months early to go back to Fort Rucker to learn how to fly the Echo model, and then go back to JBLM and deploy. And it was honestly probably about 2 months at JBLM, and then I was in Afghanistan.
What was different about the newer model? Anything that stands out?
Power, lots more power. So, with helicopters, everything is done in terms of percent of torque and what kind of maneuvers can you do with that power setting. So, in a hot day in the summer, a Delta model might require 80% torque to hover, whereas an Echo model might only require 60%. And when you're going to the high mountains of Afghanistan, that's a huge difference in what you're able to do. You can go faster, you can fly higher, you can hover in higher altitude locations, you can carry more munitions. So it's, especially somewhere like Afghanistan, it's a huge advantage.
Sounds awesome. I literally have no idea what you just said, but that's, sounds great. As long as the guy doesn't crash, it's really, I think any passenger on a helicopter who's not a pilot really cares about. So more power sounds good. I'll take your word for it. I kid. But so you end up back in Afghanistan. Where are you going now?
I had the privilege of going almost everywhere in Afghanistan, but originally my posting was in Coast. So a very small base in Coast, basically just supporting medevac mission, hoping to catch the occasional, actual ground support or even a direct action kind of mission. But for the most part, it was medevac support.
Now, this is when, 2016?
2017.
2017. Okay.
ISIS is also a thing. So ISIS is now a thing in Afghanistan in 2017 as well.
Yeah, very much so. But and reading in your notes ahead of time, you had an aircraft accident prior to deploying?
I did. And that was
Can you tell?
That's why Korea,
because of too much power?
No, unfortunately. It was actually in Korea. It was an accident on the ground. It was pretty bad. And it's actually, it's probably a good time to talk about it because I don't talk about it very much. So we're getting ready to do this big mission. We get canceled for weather, and we're like, hey, at least we can do is we can set the next crew up for success by doing their engine checks for them. And while we're doing our engine checks, we're like, hey, our tail wheel is unlocked. And what that basically means on Army helicopters, that if the tail is unlocked and you apply power, the aircraft is going to spin. Like, well, we don't want that. We need to lock the tail wheel. So we're going to back up and we're going to pull forward so that we can lock the tail wheel so that we don't set the other crew up for failure. And I still don't remember exactly what happened. Myself and the pilot in command, who is an amazing pilot, he's still in the Army, he's an instructor pilot. We still don't have 100% just because what happened next was just insane. But essentially the aircraft started spinning in the pad and we impacted another aircraft. And once, big things that spin under jet turbine power run into things that stop them, bad things happen. And essentially we just got whiplashed. The aircraft broke itself apart. The rotor system flapped backwards, cut the tail boom, and then flapped forwards and cut the canopy off the aircraft. And when the rotor blade actually hit me in the head and knocked my helmet off my head. It was about a 3-second accident that caused $30 million worth of damage.
Okay. Outside of your head, I'll get to that in a minute. And if it's okay, yeah, the paperwork for that thing must have been just incredibly insane.
Yeah. I've still got a statement of charges for $29,700,000.
You do not.
They didn't make me pay it because there's no way. But it's it's part of the normal process of the investigation. They do have to initially charge you for the damages, and then they decide whether or not they're going to make you pay for it. And they're like, no, we're not going to make you pay for it.
Okay, so I describe getting hit in the head with a rotor blade.
Well, I didn't actually know that is what happened until many days later. But the experience of the accident was far more traumatic than anything that happened on the infantry deployment in 2012.
Really?
Because I was absolutely certain, beyond a shadow of a doubt, that I was going to die. I knew that the aircraft was being chewed up by the rotors over top of me. I know of several instances where the person in the front seat has had their head chopped off by a rotor blade. I could hear the canopy disintegrating. The aircraft is just buckling incessantly, and like I have no control over. There's nothing I can do. It's absolutely powerless. So I just got my head down. I'm like, this is it. This is how it goes. And the only time that I started to get hope that it was going to be okay is when I heard the turbines start to wind down, because the pilot was able to get the power levers off very fast. Like I said, this is all happening in 3 seconds.
Anybody else injured massively or seriously or anything?
A piece of a rotor blade did cut a guy in the leg, and he bled pretty good, but nothing life-threatening. He was taken care of, but he was about 100 yards away in the hangar. This was on the tarmac in front of the hangar. So anybody who's been to Korea probably knows about this story and has heard about the time that the aircraft crashed on the pad in front of the hangar. But fortunately, no one was seriously hurt. He had that little cut on his leg. Took him out of action for a little bit. I had, obviously some neck trauma. I couldn't move my neck for a couple weeks. And the pilot in the back seat, he was sore for a while too. A little bit of neck soreness just from the whiplash, but thank God, other than that, everybody walked away and everybody got to continue their careers. So it was.
So nobody was at fault for this, and just a freak accident?
Pilot error. It's almost always pilot error. Essentially, the accident investigation, which only part of it was released to us, was that the pilot on the controls reacted incorrectly to an unexpected yaw, which is a spin. So essentially, an aircraft is supposed to spin one way when you apply power, and it spun the other way. And we think what happened is just instinctually, the pilot on the controls hit the wrong pedal. But we honestly don't know, because neither of us remembers after the.
Is it kind of like turning into the skid as opposed to away from the skid kind of reaction?
Yeah, I would say it'd be a good comparison.
Okay.
But again, like we remember so little. I mean, it happened very, very fast, and the next thing we know, we're climbing out of a aircraft that's leaking fuel and hydraulic fluid. And
now, do you remember so little because you almost got your head chopped off, or remember so little just because it was long ago? Like, what is it due to memory loss or anything like that?
There was no concussion or anything like that. I think it was just
a concussion. A rotor blade hit you in the head. I'd like to go check that diagnosis.
No, I mean, they checked me out pretty thoroughly at the hospital. I mean, I had
military doctors, great, wonderful.
A little bit of a cracked, not crack, but like I don't know, something with the cervical spine. I can't remember what it was. Okay. But
does it bother you that your worst accident in a helicopter was on the tarmac and not even in combat?
Oh, it's super embarrassing.
You ever get shot down? No. I have been in a helicopter accident in the parking lot.
Yep. That's like saying you crashed into a parked car in a helicopter. Yeah. But then you show them the pictures and people are like, oh, okay. That's that looks pretty bad. So we'll give you a pass on that one.
So by all accounts, Afghanistan was pretty easy after you almost got your head chopped off by a rotor blade.
Oh yeah. It was Afghanistan as an Apache pilot was a blast. It was fun from day one to date. I even tried to stay longer, but they wouldn't let me.
So the view of combat from above and the view of combat on the ground, obviously very different, but do you have an advantage as a pilot, as one of the few pilots who's had that ground combat experience?
I would say initially, yes, especially in the Apache and Kiowa community.
What do you mean initially?
Because there's a steep learning curve in terms of how do you talk to the ground force? How do you help them best? How do you understand what they're trying to do? What words and tactics are they using? So as a new pilot, this is kind of weird that we do it this way. The newer pilot is the one generally talking on the radios and talking to the ground force and setting up all these engagements, and the more experienced pilot's flying the aircraft. Whereas in reality, it's probably a little bit easier to switch those roles, but the Army can continue to do what it does. For me, it was easy because I'd done it. I had been down there. I understood what these guys wanted. I understood what they were trying to accomplish. So if I looked at a map, I could talk them onto a building, or I could talk them onto a target and have a conversation with a JTAC or an FO. And it really wasn't difficult for me because I could orient myself to what they were doing. For guys that hadn't had kind of ground experience, it was a little bit more difficult to learn that part of flying the helicopter, because that's nothing that they had ever been experienced or trained on or anything like that. But as you go on and you do it a couple hundred times, eventually those guys, they start to figure it out too.
What's the experience between watching a positively identified target fall when you do it from the ground versus when you do it from the air?
So everything is recorded in the aircraft. So it's definitely a much more professional environment. So there's definitely a lot of gratification in pulling the trigger, following the hellfire to the target, and watching it, do its thing. But it's not the same as if you're on the ground where you're jumping up, going, "Fuck yeah, motherfucker, that's so cool, woo!" You're just like, "Roger, left turn out." Like you're
infantryman.
You're still doing your thing. You have to follow all your procedures. You got to make sure you're safe in the aircraft. So in the cockpit during the engagement, it's all business. If something really cool happened, you take it back after everybody's done. You go into the shed and you're like, "Dude, check this out." And then you're just not being recorded anymore.
Yeah, I guess save your celebrations for after the aircraft is on the ground, right? Although I don't really know of many instances, at least it didn't happen to me, where there's a lot of high-fiving going on between ground combat. No one stops. "Hey, dude, nice shot. Yeah." That's not people would do it.
No, definitely not. Not between us. But if we get a JDAM, we're gonna pump some fists, or a good rocket run by an Apache. I'm gonna celebrate that. But I'll be like, "Dude, that was some really nice suppressive fire you put down with that saw. I'm really impressed with
that." The compliments Army people pay each other. So like, I guess because you've had that experience, I mean, you clearly know how vital the role is. And I guess emotionally, it's, as you mentioned, like when you see a JDAM or whatever, it's such a lift on the ground to know that there's that much firepower above covering your ass. Was there an extra reward in that for you, knowing that you just allowed those guys to breathe a little bit easier for a split second?
Yeah, and I could point to a really specific example that
Go ahead.
highlighted that for me is while we were supporting guys in the ISIS fight, the Special Operations Forces, they had regular infantry guys attached to them, both for security, extra guns, drivers, all that kind of stuff. And a couple of those regular infantry guys were sitting up on top of this hilltop OP doing what they're supposed to do, and they got hit with a mortar. And we're in the next valley over, but we start getting radio calls, and we come over, and they have no comms. They're on top of a hill. Nobody's within 20 minutes of them, and they're exposed. Like they got 4 or 5 casualties. They're trying to treat them, and they have no comms. So we became that link for them. And the guy in my backseat, phenomenal pilot, another former grunt, understands, and we are always in sync. It's all about the ground force all the time, always about the ground guys. So there was no discussion between us. We knew we were going to do what we needed to do. We came down very low, started pulling really tight circles over top of these guys for 2 reasons. 1, we wanted to take any fire that was going to be directed at them. 2, we were actually using our sensors and cameras to look at their casualties, to write their 9 line up for them, so that because they couldn't call it in. So we did
see that closely with the level of, or you just were given the basic first 3 or 4 lines of the 9 line.
Just the first.
Okay. Yeah, gotcha.
Enough to get the birds off the ground.
Right. Gotcha.
I mean, the cameras are pretty good, but I couldn't tell exact nature of their injuries. And then we remained there and pulled over until we started to see guys run up the hill. We came up in altitude so we could call in the medevac, and we were right on top of those guys all the way up until they were on the bird. And for me, that was the most rewarding mission that I did in Afghanistan in 2017. We didn't shoot a single person. Well, we shot somebody later that day, but
except for that one guy.
during that particular event, we didn't fire anything. It was just us supporting the ground force in a way that was most beneficial to them, which was that they could focus on treating their casualties. We had the medevac, we had their security, and I was able to reach out months later. All those guys were fine. They all are back doing their thing. There were no super serious injuries. So that was rewarding to me to finally be that shield for, you know, an infantryman that I experienced in 2000, to kind of bring it all full circle. So
I always ask pilots this because it's an experience I haven't had. But more importantly, just to the level of how our minds process these things. Ground combat and seeing things unfold in front of you as a way of ingraining itself in your memory. From the air, for lack of a better term, it's a lot less personal. It's more impersonal. You know, it's like you said, it's all business. Target acquired, firing, target engaged, you know, break left, head back. And, you know, there's nothing about it that ever really, and it's not that there's no danger in what you're doing, but the imminent danger and the feeling of bullets whizzing past your head or bombs going off near you isn't always there. So describe for me, from your standpoint, was there anything about pulling the trigger in the cockpit that's different than pulling the trigger on the ground for you personally?
So, especially between those two deployments, when I pulled the trigger in the cockpit, I was pulling it on a confirmed target. I knew exactly what I was shooting. I had a very specific target. If I didn't, I wouldn't be pulling the trigger.
Right.
As an infantryman, it was kind of like, hey, shoot that way. So in that way, it was actually a little bit more personal in the cockpit, just because I knew the effect that I was having. I could see it. But on the other hand, like you said, I'm doing everything through a video screen. So I'm not really it's not like I'm shooting a person and I'm having to watch them drop. That's not something I ever had to experience. So I can't speak to that experience on the ground personally. But it is a little bit detached. But where I would say that you get very, very personal in the aircraft, especially in the attack and scout community, is when the guys on the ground are in a bad spot, or if they lose a guy, it crushes you. It is the worst feeling ever. Be like, I couldn't help that guy. That's when it gets very personal.
Did that happen to you?
It happened. I never lost a guy under me, but the guys that got hit, like in the story before, and then there was one time we were supposed to pop up to respond to a mission, and we couldn't get up, and they did lose a guy, and that was extremely frustrating.
What do you mean couldn't get up?
Weather. We couldn't get up because of weather.
Oh, okay, gotcha.
So you can waive certain weather requirements based on the situation, and at the time the guys weren't in combat, so we were just supposed to be overhead security, which usually means that they don't get messed with. So they didn't see it was necessary to waive the weather requirements, and it was pretty far away too, so it was right at the edge of the range. And they took a mortar hit, and I think they lost 2 guys. So that was super frustrating to think that if we had been there, maybe we could have prevented that.
How long was that deployment?
It was a short 8 months, right at the edge of 8 months, which I was like, I can stay I can stay a little longer. You can push me out to a year if you want. It was shorter than I wanted it to be.
Okay.
But I got to experience a lot on that deployment, including going back to Kandahar and getting to fly over Panjwai and getting to fly over Sperwangar and get some real closure on that particular experience. So,
what about flying over there gave you closure?
You know, just seeing that it's done. To see Sperwangar, which is where I was stationed in 2012, and to see it be completely devoid and be like, hey, that's an era of my life that is now over. I've seen it to completion. I don't know. It was just to look down and see places that you had walked, or seen places that you had been shot at, or seen places where people had been blown up, or all these different locations, and you're taking it in all at once because you're flying it over in like 3 minutes. You're experiencing 9 months of combat in 3 minutes of overflight. It was very powerful. But looking back on it, that was the moment I was like, hey, that deployment's over for me. Like I can put that behind me. Little did I know, 5 years later, I'd passed.
You get back from that deployment. Do you know at this point in time that you're going to end up calling it a career?
No, I mean, at this point, I was still pretty motivated. I thought I was going to go and become an instructor pilot and do all these kind of wonderful things with my career. I now had 2 combat deployments, and I had a lot of experience. I was really looking forward to continue that. But This is where that conversation about PTS really is important. I started to have issues a couple months after we got back, and it kind of tied into some maintenance issues that Boeing was having with the aircraft that were pretty terrifying. Rotor blades flying off mid-flight, not exactly the greatest thing.
Seems like a small problem.
Minor problem. And I started to have nightmares and flashbacks to my accident, and all kinds of stuff was really distracting me. And I got to get through JRTC. If I get through JRTC, then I should be fine. It's just really stressful. Flew JRTC, and then I came back and I told my commander, I am not good. My head is not in the fight. I'm having issues in the cockpit, and I need to go get help.
Are you surprised that you didn't have nightmares immediately after, as opposed to when you got back from the deployment of your accident? I mean,
no, I attribute that to compartmentalization. And
okay.
A lot of the same reasons that I never really had issues with my first deployment until much later as well, is that I went straight from my first deployment into I'm going to flight school. So my brain went straight into a different mode. It didn't look back. It was always looking forward. After the accident, it's like, I got to get to JBLM. I got to get to Afghanistan. I really wanted to deploy. It was everything that I wanted. So then I was there, and then I was deployed. So that was my entire focus. So it wasn't until we came back and it was like, hey, like now your brain has some downtime. Like there's nothing on the schedule. You're not going anywhere. There's no major schools coming up. There's no change in your career happening anytime soon. And that compounded with the maintenance issues that we were having really started to make me a very poor teammate, a very poor soldier. I was still a fine pilot, but it was just my brain wasn't 100% in the cockpit. And once those thoughts started to intrude upon me while I was supposed to doing something that required 100% of my mind and attention, I didn't feel like I was the best crewmate for anybody else I was flying with. That was dangerous. In reality, was I fine? Probably. But it's not a chance that I was willing to take with somebody else.
Were you upset that you weren't able to compartmentalize it the second time around?
It was frustrating. It was frustrating, being in the field, either at gunnery or JRTC, and being scared going up to the aircraft or dreading getting in the aircraft because it was something that I loved to do. That was incredibly frustrating.
When you tell your commander, I'm not right, what's your commander's response?
Overwhelming support. He was like, do what you got to do. We'll take you off the flight schedule. Go see the doc. They precautionary grounding. I mean, they didn't have to do that. They could have kept me flying up until the doc said, no, we can't. He went out of his way to make sure that I got a quick appointment with the flight doctor, and the flight doctor was wonderful about making sure I got a quick appointment with behavioral health. And other than the battalion commander, who will remain nameless because he's a douchebag, everybody else was super supportive. They understood. Almost everybody's had close calls. Everybody's had those moments. And a lot of people are like, hey, I wish I had gone and I'd done that. And for me, the most rewarding part about that was that my willingness to go do it inspired a good friend of mine to do the same. And it probably saved his life. And that to me made it worth it. The loss of my flying career, the loss of all that stuff, the fact that he was able to go get help, he got better, and now he's in 160th. So he completely turned his entire career around because he said, hey, Curtis went and did it, and he didn't lose his career, and he didn't lose the respect, and I can do this, I can get help, and I can continue my career. And he did, and that makes it worth it to me.
For those listening, 160 at the 168th SOAR, Special Operations Aviation Regiment. It's the sort of Green Berets of the pilot world for the Army. So best pilots in the world. And by the way, we support calling out douchebags on this podcast. If someone's a douchebag, we want to let the world know. So feel free to drop names if you feel so. But so you end up going through, obviously, the medical board and everything else, and they decide your career is over. Are you upset, angry, hurt, disappointed? What are the emotions?
A little bit of all. I love flying. I miss it. Every time I get to go up with somebody else and fly, especially in a helicopter, I really enjoy it. I hope that one day it's an option again for me to fly. The FAA is just not super friendly to that whole idea. They put a lot of roadblocks into that. But the idea that I would never get to fly either, definitely professionally for a while, and maybe not ever, was, yeah, it was a huge kick in the nuts. But at the same time, I walked away from the Army happy and with no anxiety and no issues. And for my personal health, it was a relief. So it was very contradictory to have this immense relief and happiness, but at the same time, not necessarily regret, but I guess mourning, grief over the loss of something that I really loved.
So, as you're forced to move on to the next phase of your life, what from the deployment is still hanging over you, if anything at all, or deployments, I should say?
When I think about deployments, it still always goes back to 2012 because, like I said, 2017 was just, for me, it was fun. I had a blast. But there are things you can't ever fully get rid of, such as guilt. Like I mentioned, there were several times where somebody else was holding a mine detector that I either had recently just been holding or should have been holding. And those guys lost legs. And as many times as they tell me it's fine, I'm good, that always permeates through your mind as, hey, it should have been me. Stuff like that's really hard to let go of. And I inadvertently formed a very close friendship with the family of one of the guys that we lost, which has been a wonderful experience, but it's very, very powerful, especially around the time of year that he was lost. When we did an episode where his medic talked about that day, those very intense memories definitely get to me sometimes, and it's just really hard to try to grapple with why didn't he get to go home to his loving family. That's probably the hardest part.
So how does the idea for the Panjwai podcast come about? And you mentioned an episode, but like, what was going through your mind? Was it something where you just had to sort of get all the emotions out, or was there something more to it?
So Luke and I actually started Luke Coffey, who was my co-host and co-founder and everything. We're writing a book about the deployment, and not because it was anything exceptional or wonderful, but just because we thought it was a very grounded grunt experience, and it would really tell the story of what it was like to be a grunt in Afghanistan. But we're starting this like 8 years out, so there's so much that we didn't remember, so much that we couldn't like quite place in the timelines. So we need to talk to people, we need to interview people, and then the need to interview obviously evolves into the need to record the interviews so you can go back and listen to them. And if you're recording the interviews, we're like, well, we could release them as a podcast. Some people might be interested in listening to that. And lo and behold, quite a few people did want to listen to that. So that kind of turned into the podcast. And then that contributed to the podcast evolving beyond our personal deployment to include people who'd served at all eras of combat in Panjwai.
So when you started recording, obviously there was something that stuck out to you. There was some story, some sort of moment where the light bulb goes on. Do you remember what that was?
Oh man, I don't know. I think it was probably even before we started recording that, because we started recording knowing it was going to be a podcast. But when we started to realize that this is really something that people were interested in is when we started fundraising to buy the equipment to do it. And the response was so overwhelming and the support was way more than we expected. We're like, okay, this is a real thing. People are actually going to listen to this. This isn't just going to be our parents listening to it and, throwing $5 to our Kickstarter. People are actually are going to give a shit. And if people are going to give a shit, we have to do it right. We can't half-ass this. And that was probably kind of our light bulb moment was there's a real audience for these stories, and we owe it to guys like Luxmore, like Brazos, like Swindle, and Pinnock and Lilly to do it correctly and with integrity. And that was kind of our guiding moment, was that we need to buckle down and do this correctly.
Did you find that some guys were resistant to wanting to do it, or everybody was pretty much willing to step up and tell their story for the podcast?
Some guys weren't ready, and that's fine. But for by and large, I can't think of anybody except for maybe one person that we've asked to come on the podcast that didn't want to do it. we actually have the opposite problem. We have way more people that want to come on and share their stories than we can possibly ever fit in the lifespan of the podcast. Again, because I'm a audio nerd and I'm obsessed with quality, so it's quite a process for me to make the episodes.
Right. You're into or done with your second full season, correct?
We are almost done with the second full season. We I think we have like 8 or 9 more episodes left, so maybe about halfway through the second season.
When you started recording other people who served in Panjwai and had battles there, what was something that stood out to you that was either different or unique about their experience as compared to yours?
So a lot of units, it seemed, stuck a lot harder to doctrine than we did in terms of going out as full platoons, utilizing weapon squads, doing these bounding movements, which is fine. If it worked for them, it worked for them. I'm not one to judge. But either because we were undermanned or because our company commander was a Ranger Regiment guy, we quickly reduced the scale of our operations to more squad size operations. We ditched the weapon squad, and we tried to be fast and more adaptive, even to the point of like our platoon pretty much ditched the M240 halfway through and grabbed a Gustav instead. And that was just the way that we operated was a little bit different than the other units did. And that really stood out to me, that our footprint on the ground was much less in terms of the number of Americans on the ground.
Were you shocked to find out that you might not have been the best infantryman in Panjwai?
I mean, I still think we were. I'm just kidding. Well, I mean, and like I said, when we started this part, we knew we weren't like the bee's knees. You know, we were trying to tell this story because we thought we were so wonderful. We knew we weren't. But we were surprised to see the intensity of some of the combat, particularly that the Canadians saw early on in their deployments. And to some extent, the guys that were there at the same time that we were in 123 down further deeper into the Horn of Panjwai. And that's 1st and 23rd Infantry Regiment, which we were attached to for that deployment. So we weren't terribly surprised to find out the guys had it a little harder than us. But some of the stories that we heard are pretty ridiculous, and it can definitely be very humbling at times.
Now, you even went so far as to tell the story about Robert Bales, the Kandahar Massacre, at least from a point of view of people who were with him or served with him, or the backstory of it, right?
Yeah, and we had 2 soldiers that were on his squad. They were his soldiers. And they reached out and they wanted to tell their story, and we're like, absolutely. And they had quite a story to tell. And it was, like I said, that was kind of where you kind of set this character profile up of Robert Bales as this guy that I've run into like 10 times in the Army. So it was really fascinating to see the progression of this guy from when he first met them and the way he behaved, and this, degeneration, I guess, of his behavior once he got on the ground in Afghanistan, which obviously culminated in that horrible incident. I think it was, I'm glad we took 3 episodes to tell it, because I think it took 3 episodes really to process everything that they were.
Yeah. How emotional is it for you to do the podcast?
Depends. Sometimes extremely. Just yesterday I received a message from the wife of one of the guys that was on our show, one of our medics, and her words were extremely powerful, and it definitely sent me to tears because of the impact that it had on her and her family to hear him finally talk about it. We get messages from family members, spouses, the families of those who were lost, and it's always positive, and it's always thank you for letting their story be told. Thank you. We've never heard this. We really wanted to. It's taken him years to open up. And when we get messages like that, it's extremely overwhelming.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we same. We've experienced it all. How cathartic is it for you?
Early on, extremely, because when we first started in the first 3 episodes, I mean, it was our inner circle, and we're talking about our worst days.
Right.
And those experiences and those episodes, even though they're a little bit earlier on and the quality is not as good, the emotional intensity of those discussions was so intense. And after we did those first few episodes, just stepping back was like, wow, like I never realized, how impactful this was to other people, and how sometimes I just didn't even realize how impactful it was for me. And yeah, I mean, that was kind of a moment where I was like, we're kind of onto something here. This is something that needs to be done. And I encourage other veterans to do the same and tell their stories and tell their buddies stories, because it has really helped bring me a lot of a closure personally, but I see it in every person that's come on and their family members, how much it's helped.
Do you think you'll branch out past Panjwai with your podcast?
We've considered it. We definitely want to make sure we tell the story of Panjwai. And we've tossed around the idea of inviting guys who have other, have deployed to other places, and to have them tell their stories, or help them set up their own podcast to tell their own story. But right now, I mean, we're so overwhelmed with what we have in front of us, but it's something we'd love to do, because the stories just,
absolutely.
There's so many. And as you know, I mean, that's the entire basis of your podcast. And you've had some wonderful guests on the Hazard Ground and some amazing stories being told. And you guys doing it for like 6-7 years?
Coming up on 5 now. Yeah. I mean, it's we're approaching 300 episodes. I mean, it's we've been plugging away at it pretty long, pretty good now. So, but it's one of those things where, even when you think the stories may be getting old, or we've told it already, it's just somebody brings something different to the conversation always. How much are your guys willing to dive into the mental health conversation and where they are, and have those tough conversations? Because I think those are, more than anything, super important.
Extremely. And that's what I love about our podcast, is that everyone that comes on is willing to shed their, shame, I guess, and like bear it all out. I mean, we've had people talk about their suicidal thoughts, or their dark times, or how they've gotten through them, and what treatments have worked for them. And, I think almost every single guest that has gone through something like that has been, can I talk about mental health? Can I talk about my experience? And we're like, yes, please. So I've been very impressed with our guests and their willingness to confront those really difficult topics, because from the beginning, we didn't want this just to be war stories. We wanted to really dive into the human effect that the combat in that area had on these people, or just combat in general. It's super rewarding to have guests on time and time again that are willing to have those conversations.
PanjwaiPodcast.com is the website, the Panjwai Podcast. Panjwai is Panjwai, the PanjwaiPodcast.com. You can get everything there. Of course, you guys are on all of the major podcast platforms as well. And you guys even got some swag stuff for Panjwai, right?
We do. We got some t-shirts. We got some new koozies going up this week. We got, actually, it's not this hat. I'm wearing the wrong hat. We got some sweet multicam leather patch hats, some stickers, some vinyl decals. So little stuff, but every bit helps. That's what supports the podcast. Between that and our Patreon subscriptions, that is what keeps us going. It pays our bills.
Well, look, it's obviously an incredible way to go about getting the stories out there of the people. You actually, on the website too, as well, pay homage to all the guys that are no longer with us and their sacrifice. So I think that's outstanding as always. But what do you kind of hope the podcast will be when it's all said and done?
I hope that when it's all said and done, the podcast is this thing, whether it's actually a physical thing or it's just like, a thought exercise that you can put on the shelf and say, that was my experience. And that guys can, if they have kids or grandkids or family members, like, what was it like to fight in Panjwai? It's like, let me show you. Like, let's listen to it together. Let me paint you a picture. Or here's my episode where I talked about it. I want it to be a kind of a recorded history of some of those stories.
Well, that's the thing, Curtis. I mean, when we started this, we never set out to do anything other than tell stories. And it never dawned on us that we would chronicle history in a way for everybody to have forever. As long as the internet's around, these stories will be out there from a first person point of view. And it's not taking anything away from authors or movie makers or whatever, but nothing beats the individual who was there giving you their point of view. And from that standpoint, the Panjwai podcast, this one, we are literally chronicling history forever. And that is an undertaking that should probably get a little bit more, selfishly, probably should get a little bit more love from the masses. But it's no one looks at it that way, but in reality, that's what you're doing. And most importantly, like you said, when my kids ask me about my combat experience, when they're old enough to have that conversation with me, I could sit down and tell them, but I can also, what you've done is listen to this first, and then we'll have a conversation about it, and it makes it easier because you've told them the long form discussion. And I think, from that standpoint, we are fostering relationships between fathers and sons, mothers and daughters, parents and children, and it's something that forever, again, it is there. So tip a cap to you, but just understand, that's part of what you're doing unintentionally, but it's what's happening.
Yeah. And that was the wonderful byproduct of the entire thing. And I think the aspect that we never really counted on was how much more willing people are to talk about these things with somebody who's been there or experienced something.
100%. It's just the easiest thing in the world when the interviewer understands the subject. It's why rape survivors talk to other rape survivors, right? It's why, substance abuse people go to meetings with other substance abuse people. It's that commonality, that shared ground, that shared experience that makes saying things so much easier.
Yeah, I agree. And it's, I was always been surprised that the whole, for veterans, the whole sit in a circle and talk about your experience kind of group doesn't really exist. It exists in the movies, but people really don't do that. Everything is so structured and organized. And I think
it's call a 1-800 number and talk to a stranger you've never met before.
Right. Or go into the VA and do the exact thing. You get a handbook and you go through your daily exercise. That's not what a lot of guys want. They just want to talk about it. They want to talk about somebody that was there or was there at a different time, or they just want someone to be like, yeah, man, that sucks. And not be in an environment where people are like, whoa, that sounds cool, but here's what I did, and that's, if I'm going to get on my soapbox for a little bit, the veteran community has got to be better about just supporting each other, not trying to outdo each other with war stories or try to sell their coffee brand or whatever. I mean, which is fine. If you got a company, that's great to support that. But, we really need to be better about being like, hey, everybody served, everybody did their part, and everybody needs help. And it doesn't matter if you're a pogue or not. I was a fucking pogue. I admit it. It was great. I'm glad it became a pogue. But we just need to be better as a community. We need to be better veterans, and we just need to support each other. And that's my soapbox.
100%. I mean, it's very well said and easily understood. And it's kind of exactly where the mindset should be for all of this stuff. So again, the panjwaipodcast.com is where you can get all the episodes again, and wherever else you get podcasts. Guys, give this podcast some support and some love. The stories are amazing. They are incredible. And obviously, if you're a fan of this podcast, you'll be a fan of Curtis' podcast as well. Again, the panjwaipodcast.com. Curtis, man, we appreciate you spending some time with us and certainly opening up to us and giving us your personal story. But we wish you nothing but continued success with the Panjwai podcast and continue up the great work, man. And we certainly appreciate you joining us.
And I can't thank you enough for having me on and for having Luke on in the future. It's a huge privilege for us. And we very much appreciate the opportunity.
Yeah. Unfortunately, we can't go on yours because we've never been to Panjwai. So, but that's fine.
Stand it out. I'll give you a call.
I kid. No, but I and that's one thing I think that's unique and I love about it is it's even though it's sort of narrow the focus, because there was a surge and because there were so many people there and because there's so much has happened there over the course of 20 years of combat, it gets very specific to the heart of the matter. And the related experiences there are that much deeper. I mean, I've been to Afghanistan. I know what the grounds looks like. Never been to Panjwai. Sure, I can understand it, but it's different when you've been there and certain things. Just like me talking about Route Tampa and Baghdad. It's anybody who's driven up and down that road knows exactly what I'm talking about and everything else. So, and it's always fun. You can be like, do you remember that building, the one that had this? And you have somebody to be able to relate to. Yeah. So, all right, Curtis Grace, thanks for being part of the Hazard Ground, brother.
You've been listening to Killcliffe's Hazard Ground podcast, hosted by Mark Zeno. If you have an interesting story to tell and you'd like to be on the show, send us an email at producer@hazardground.com. And if you like the show, don't forget to subscribe, rate, and review on Apple Podcasts. Thanks for listening. We'll see you next time.